The clinking of glasses and forced laughter echoed off the dark wood walls of the ridiculously expensive restaurant. The whole family was there to celebrate my brother, Kevin, the family's charismatic but perpetually bailed-out golden child. He'd just been promoted to senior sales associate, and you would have thought he'd been named CEO of the entire company. My father, Mark, a man who measured a person's soul by the size of their paycheck, stood up, his chest puffed out with a pride he never showed me. He raised his wine glass, beaming at his son. To Kevin, he boomed across the table. For his grit, his ambition, and his real-world success. He knows what it takes to build something real. Then, his gaze swiveled to me, and the warmth in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a familiar dismissive glint. A cruel smirk played on his lips. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the whole table to stop and listen. "Still collecting those little degrees?" "How many is it now?" "3. The question wasn't a question at all, it was an accusation. Before I could even form a response, he waved his hand and scoffed for dramatic effect. 3 degrees? What a complete joke, he announced to his audience. The table roared with laughter. My son builds a career, my daughter builds a library of debt. The laughter washed over me, a physical wave of humiliation that felt hot and sharp. My aunts, my uncles, everyone. My mother, Sharon, a woman who mistook her son's endless neediness for love and my independence for coldness, just reached over and gave my hand a gentle, pitying pat. It was the same empty gesture she gave me when Kevin got the brand new car after his DUI, and the same one I got when they said my master's degree was a waste of good money. It was the family's official consolation prize for being the other child, the afterthought. This time, however, something inside me didn't just break, it hardened. The usual hot flush of shame that rose in my cheeks felt different. It was icy. It was a chilling, clarifying anger that settled deep in my bones like a foundation. I looked at their smiling, laughing faces, and I didn't see my family anymore. I saw a room full of strangers I had spent a lifetime trying to please. In that quiet, ringing moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this would be the very last time they ever made me feel small. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. It was just the loudest echo of a story I had been living my whole life. That laughter at the dinner table, it was the final, booming chorus of a song I'd been forced to listen to my entire life. In the mythology of my family, there were 2 distinct and parallel universes. There was Kevin's universe, and there was mine. In Kevin's world, every catastrophic failure was reframed as a charming learning opportunity. Every desperate plea for a bailout was a sign of his endearing closeness to family, and every handout was simply an investment in his boundless potential. His path through life was a freshly paved superhighway, complete with guardrails and a pit crew ready to fix any crash. In my universe, every hard-won achievement was met with a vague, almost suspicious nod. Every request for help was irrefutable proof of my failure, and every step I took on my own was twisted into an act of cold, prideful defiance. They didn't see independence, they saw a daughter who was actively rejecting them, and they punished me for it with distance. This narrative was our family's bedrock, so deeply ingrained that to question it was to question reality itself. I remember with piercing, cinematic clarity the night my brother, Kevin, then 17, wrapped my father's brand-new luxury sedan around a 100-year-old oak tree on Miller Road. He had been drinking with his friends, a fact that was immediately and deliberately scrubbed from the official record. I was at the kitchen table trying to finish a calculus assignment, when the phone call came. I watched my father's face, expecting rage, but saw only a deep, panicked concern for his boy. When Kevin stumbled through the door an hour later, reeking of cheap beer and unearned confidence, there was no yelling. There was no grounding. There were no consequences at all. The following weekend, a gleaming, even nicer car sat in our driveway, adorned with a ridiculously large red bow. My father stood with his arm around Kevin's shoulders, a portrait of paternal pride. "A man has got to learn his limits," he announced to the family. This was just a valuable, if expensive, life lesson. I just stared, speechless. A life lesson? The internal ledger in my mind began to furiously click and whir. This lesson was being paid for by the money that wasn't there for my braces 2 years prior, the summer science camp I was told we couldn't afford, the art classes I had begged for. Kevin was rewarded for his recklessness, praised for a wisdom he hadn't earned, and the family myth of the golden child grew ever stronger. 5 years later, the contrast was painted in brutal, stark colors. I was in my first year of grad school, 1,000 miles from home, when my 15-year-old rust bucket, a car I'd bought with my own savings from a high school job, finally gave up. The transmission died with a violent shudder on the side of a dark, unfamiliar highway. After an hour of panicked silence, I swallowed my pride and called my dad. My voice was shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer humiliation of having to ask. I wasn't asking for a new car like Kevin got. I was just asking for a small loan, a few $100s to fix the transmission so I could get to my classes and my part-time library job. The silence on his end of the line was deafening, thick with judgment. Then came the words that would become the anthem of my 20s, figure it out. That's what your fancy education is for, right? And then, a click. He hung up. So I figured it out. I picked up a 30-hour-a-week waitressing job at a greasy diner, working on top of my full-time graduate course load. I can still feel the bone-deep exhaustion of those months, the constant smell of burnt coffee and fried food clinging to my clothes as I tried to decipher dense academic theory at 2 a.m. My hands were perpetually raw from the harsh dish soap, my back ached, and I survived on caffeine and sheer will. 6 months later, I walked into a used car lot and paid for another old beater in cash. Every dollar earned one $5 tip at a time. I never told them about the waitressing or the new car. I knew they wouldn't be proud. They would just see it as more proof that I didn't really need them, justifying their distance. My mother, Carol, was the silent, steady architect of this whole dynamic. She operated under a warped logic where Kevin's constant need for rescue was a testament to his deep, loving connection to the family. He needed them, which in turn made her feel needed, loved, and important. My fierce self-reliance, however, she interpreted as a personal slight. "You're just too proud, honey," she'd say with a sad, gentle sigh. "You never let anybody in." She couldn't grasp that I didn't let them in because the door was locked from their side. This flawed reasoning was the engine of the grand false narrative they all lived by. In their shared delusion, Kevin was the practical people person, the one with street smarts destined to conquer the business world. His simple sales job was real, tangible. Me? I was the ethereal one, the perpetual student, aimlessly drifting through academia and collecting useless pieces of paper. They had no clue what my degrees were in: international relations, cybersecurity, a master's in strategic intelligence. To them, these were just abstract, nonsensical phrases. For years, I stopped trying to correct them. Explaining my life's work would require a level of genuine curiosity and respect they had never once offered. It was just easier, less painful, to let them believe their comforting lies. That night at the restaurant, when my father held up my life's work as a punchline, it was the culmination of everything. It was the ghost of the totaled car, the ghost of the dead transmission, the echo of every time I had been told to figure it out on my own. The chorus of laughter wasn't just about a single cruel joke. It was the final, booming invoice for 2 decades of being made to feel invisible, of my successes being erased and my struggles being ignored. Lying in bed after that dinner, the laughter still ringing in my ears, I realized they would never see me. So I decided to make them see the truth instead. That night, sleep was impossible. The mocking laughter from the restaurant played on a loop in my head, but it no longer stung. The pain had been cauterized, leaving behind something clean, hard, and incredibly calm. For years, I had been playing a game I could never win, a game where I begged for scraps of approval from people who had already decided I was worthless. I was done begging. The decision crystallized not in a flash of anger, but in a wave of profound, chilling clarity. I wasn't going to seek revenge. Revenge was their kind of game, loud and messy. My goal was simpler, and far more devastating. I was going to force them to see the truth, the one I had allowed them to ignore for far too long. I would stop trying to earn their love, and instead, I would command their respect on my own terms. A week later, the universe delivered the perfect stage. A thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, an ostentatious invitation announced that my father, Mark, was being honored as the Businessman of the Year by the local Chamber of Commerce. It was the absolute pinnacle of his professional life, a public coronation of everything he valued. The event was to be held at a grand hotel ballroom, a hotel that happened to be less than 5 miles from the front gates of Peterson Air Force Base, the place I spent 60 hours a week. Tucked inside the invitation was a handwritten note from my father on his personal stationery. His perfect, looping script read, "Thought you might want to come. Maybe you can see what real success looks like." The condescension was so thick I could practically feel it dripping off the page. I read the note, and for the first time I didn't feel a sting of hurt. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. "Oh, I'll be there," I thought. "And you'll see it too." My plan didn't involve spreadsheets, secret recordings, or a dramatic presentation of receipts. My receipt was my entire life. It was the person I had become while they weren't looking. As I scanned the event details on the invitation, my eyes snagged on the name of the keynote speaker, and a slow smile spread across my face. The speaker was Lieutenant General Miller, my commanding officer. General Miller was a decorated 2-star general in the U.S. Air Force, a man who oversaw critical national security operations for Cyber Command, and a leader known for his sharp intellect and absolute integrity. He was also my direct superior. He didn't know a Mark or a Kevin. He certainly didn't know me as a perpetual student with a library of debt. He knew me as Major Evans, one of his most trusted lead intelligence officers. He knew me as the person who briefed him on classified global threats before he had his morning coffee. My truth wasn't something I had to prove with documents. It was embodied in the respect of a man like him. The plan, therefore, was breathtakingly simple. I wasn't going to orchestrate a confrontation or deliver a tearful speech. I wasn't going to do anything, really. I was just going to attend. I would wear a simple, elegant black dress, not my uniform. The power was in the contrast, in the collision of their world and my real one. I wouldn't seek out the general. I wouldn't have to. I would simply place myself in the room, a living, breathing contradiction to their lifelong narrative about me, and I would let the inevitable happen. The two worlds I had kept so carefully separated were finally going to collide. I picked up my phone and sent a short text to my father, my fingers steady. Looking forward to it. I'll be there. A strange sense of peace settled over me. There was no more anger, no more hurt. Just the quiet, patient certainty of a bomb waiting for its timer to count down. I had the truth. I had the uniform hanging in my closet. All that was left was to choose the right moment to let my two worlds collide and burn their perfect narrative to the ground. The hotel ballroom was a shimmering ocean of black ties and expensive perfume, humming with the low-grade roar of self-congratulation and clinking glasses. I located my name on a card at a table tucked in the far back corner, a no-man's land right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. It was the designated family section, a polite exile. From this vantage point, I had a perfect unobstructed view of my father, Mark, holding court near the stage. He was in his absolute element, a king surveying his temporary rented castle. He clapped powerful men on the back, laughed a booming laugh that was just a little too loud, and radiated a smug, unassailable confidence that set my teeth on edge. Beside him stood my brother Kevin, flawlessly playing the role of the handsome crown prince, smirking and nodding at all the right moments. My mother Carol drifted between them, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated pride. She caught my eye once and gave me a small, tight, pitying smile that said, "Isn't this all just wonderful? Isn't your father amazing?" I simply nodded back, my face a placid lake, and took a slow sip of water. I felt strangely detached, like a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction from behind reinforced glass. After the appetizers were cleared, and the wine had been generously refilled, my father spotted me from across the room. He gestured for me to come over with an imperious flick of his wrist, a summons, not an invitation. As I weaved through the tables and approached, he draped a heavy, proprietary arm around my shoulder, pulling me into his circle of local business titans. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice dripping with a false folksy bonhomie, "I'd like you to meet my brilliant daughter." He paused for dramatic effect, then let out a theatrical sigh. "She's the scholar of the family." He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate but felt like an anchor. "She has 3 degrees. Can you believe that?" 3 of them? The men, all silver-haired and wearing expensive watches, chuckled politely. Their eyes glazed over with a profound disinterest as they looked at me, the way you'd look at a strange piece of modern art your host was proud of for some inexplicable reason. My father then leaned in, as if sharing a hilarious secret. "She's still figuring out what to do with them, of course. Meanwhile, my son Kevin is out there in the real world, actually making things happen." The punchline landed with a thud. More polite chuckles. I just stood there, my expression unreadable, my heart beating a slow, steady, deliberate rhythm. Any second now, I thought to myself, when the world is about to change. At that exact moment, a wave of applause for the keynote speaker thundered through the ballroom. On stage, Lieutenant General Miller, immaculate in his Air Force dress uniform covered in rows of ribbons, gave a crisp nod to the audience. He stepped off the dais, and a path immediately cleared for him as if by an invisible force. My father's eyes lit up with predatory glee. Here was his chance to cap off the night by shaking hands with a 2-star general, the ultimate trophy. He released my shoulder and physically straightened his tie, puffing his chest out. "Now there's a true leader," my father muttered to his friends, readying his introduction. But General Miller wasn't stopping to glad hand. He moved with a focused purpose that cut through the meandering crowd, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced efficiency. For one heart-stopping second, I thought he might not see me. Then, his eyes locked with mine. A flicker of recognition. A slight, almost imperceptible nod. He changed his trajectory. He was walking directly toward our little circle. My father saw it and beamed, assuming the general was coming for him. He took a half-step forward, his hand outstretched, a Cheshire cat grin plastered on his face. The general didn't even glance at him. He walked right past my father's extended hand, as if it were a piece of furniture, his eyes fixed only and intensely on me. The energy in our little group vaporized. The polite chatter died instantly. My father's grin faltered, his hand still hanging awkwardly in the air. General Miller stopped precisely 1 foot in front of me, his posture a ramrod of pure discipline and authority. The entire area around us fell utterly silent. He brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so flawless, that I could hear the faint, crisp sound of his white gloves snapping against his brow. It was a gesture of profound, unambiguous and official respect. And then, in a clear, formal voice that sliced through the ballroom's hum like a surgeon's scalpel, he spoke a single, world-shattering word. "Major." It hung in the air, an incomprehensible bomb detonating in the dead silence. My father's face, which seconds before had been flushed with triumph, turned a pasty, ashen gray. His jaw went slack. Kevin looked as if he'd been slapped, his eyes wide with a vacant confusion. The general lowered his salute and leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential professional tone that everyone strained to catch. "Your briefing on the Rykov asset was flawless, Evans. The Pentagon wants a full follow-up." He straightened up. "See you at 0500 for the deployment sync." He gave me one last curt nod, turned on his heel and walked away, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. The silence he left behind was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of my father's world. He stood there, frozen, a statue of crumbling pride. The men who had been laughing at his joke just moments before were now staring, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning recalculation. They looked at the retreating general, then at me, this quiet, unassuming daughter with her useless degrees, and then back at my father, their eyes now holding 1,000 questions he could never, ever answer. And in the ringing silence, watching the ashes of my father's pride settle around him, I didn't feel anger or victory. I just felt quiet. For the first time, I was the one who got to walk away. I gave my father one last, long, clinical look. His face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock, his mouth slightly agape as his brain struggled to process the new reality that had just detonated in front of him. His eyes, wide with a horror that was slowly being eclipsed by a dawning, humiliating comprehension, finally saw me. He looked small. He looked utterly pathetic. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. General Miller had said everything necessary. I simply turned my back on him, on the circle of his stunned friends, on my bewildered mother who was stammering my name, and on Kevin, who just looked lost. I walked. The journey across the vast ballroom floor felt like a mile, every head turning to watch me, whispers erupting in my wake like small fires. I kept my head high and my pace steady, my heels clicking a rhythm of departure on the polished marble. I walked right out the grand entrance and into the cool, cleansing night air. The valet brought my car, and as soon as I slid into the driver's seat, the silence was shattered. My phone began to buzz. And buzz. And buzz. A relentless, frantic vibration against the leather seat. A cascade of texts and calls from my father, my mother, and Kevin. Their names flashed one after another, a desperate digital chorus. I looked at the screen, at their panic, and felt nothing but a profound sense of distance. Then, with a calm I had never known, I pressed and held the power button until the screen went black. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A few weeks later, the memory of the gala felt like a scene from someone else's life, a distant and blurry news report about a storm that had passed. I stood inside a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility, on Peterson Air Force Base, the air humming with the quiet, controlled energy of important work being done. The room was windowless, secure, and my sanctuary. Dressed in my U.S. Air Force Service uniform, I was at the head of a long conference table, pointing to a series of complex satellite images and encrypted data streams on a large, glowing screen. The room was filled with other officers, men and women of varying ranks, all of them focused, intelligent, and deeply engaged. Here, my opinion wasn't a family punchline, it was mission-critical data. My years of study weren't a library of dead, they were a vital national security asset. When I spoke about threat assessments and strategic vulnerabilities, people listened, they took notes. They asked clarifying questions that challenged me and made my analysis stronger. There was a camaraderie in that room, a deep and unspoken respect born of shared purpose, something my family, with their petty dramas and shallow values, could never possibly comprehend. This was my real world. This was the life I had built for myself, brick by painful, painstaking brick, far away from their suffocating shadow. I was not invisible here. I was Major Evans. One evening, after a grueling 14-hour shift preparing for the deployment, I saw a single voicemail had somehow slipped through my digital fortress. It was from my father. A morbid curiosity, or perhaps a need for that one last piece of evidence, got the better of me. I pressed play. His voice was a strange, jarring mixture of desperation and a fawning, unnatural pride I'd never heard before. It wasn't the voice of a man who was sorry. It was the voice of a man frantically trying to rewrite history to place himself at the center of my success. "Hey, it's Dad," he began, his tone unctuous and slick. "Listen, that night at the gala. Wow. Just wow. A major. In the Air Force. I had absolutely no idea. I mean, your mother and I are just so incredibly proud. I've been telling everyone at the club, you know? My daughter. The major." He chuckled. A wet, nervous sound that made my skin crawl. "They're all very impressed." Very. "So listen, I was thinking, you should come over for dinner. And hey, maybe you could invite your boss? That General Miller? I'd love to take you both out to the Capitol Grill, my treat. We could talk about, whatever it is you important people do." The offer hung there in the silence of my apartment, a perfect monument to his complete and utter lack of understanding. He wasn't proud of me. He was aroused by my proximity to power, and he wanted to wear my rank like it was his own medal. I listened to the message twice, letting the full weight of his self-serving delusion sink in. There wasn't a single word of apology, not for that night, not for the years of belittling my choices. Not for the phone call when my car broke down and he told me to figure it out. Not for any of it. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was just profoundly embarrassed that he got caught looking like a fool in front of men he respected more than his own daughter. A profound, weary sadness washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a liberating sense of finality. This was the proof. This was the period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second, then I firmly pressed delete. The message vanished into the ether. I then went into my contacts, found his name and tapped block this caller. A small pop-up asked me to confirm. I did, and felt a shudder unlatch in my soul. Then I did the same for my mother, the silent enabler, and for Kevin, the golden boy. Tap, block, confirm. With each press, I felt a weight lifting, a chain breaking. It wasn't an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of peace. It was me, finally, choosing to guard my own gate. Months later, I got a call from a cousin I still occasionally spoke to. She was trying and failing to stifle her laughter as she told me the story. Apparently, my father had been at a high-stakes business lunch, trying to impress a potential new client from out of state. In a desperate attempt to project power and influence, he had casually name-dropped me. "My daughter is a major in Air Force Cyber Command, you know," he'd said, puffing out his chest and leaning back in his chair. Very high-level, classified stuff. Reports directly to the Pentagon. He'd expected the client to be dazzled. Unfortunately for him, the client was a retired U.S. Navy captain, a quiet, serious man who had spent 30 years in a world where you don't use your family's service as a cheap bargaining chip at a steakhouse. My cousin said the captain just gave my father a dead flat look and said, "Good for her," before immediately changing the subject to quarterly earnings. The deal, she said, mysteriously fell through the next day. Their narrative was broken. They were left fumbling with a truth they couldn't spin or profit from, and without that, they had nothing left. They hadn't changed, but it no longer mattered. Their story had no power over mine anymore. I learned that you can't wait for people to give you respect. You have to command it by building a life they can't ignore. If you've ever had to become your own hero because the ones you were given failed you, drop a comment below. Your story matters.